What's the scariest story you've ever heard? Story 1. About 10 years ago, I was recently divorced and living alone in a one-bedroom apartment. The place was clean and the rent was decent. It was one of those places that had a doorman, and I felt safe there. I was alone and loving it, focused on my career and not on my clingy ex-husband. Things were finally looking up for me. At the time, I was working pretty late at the office and would often stumble into my apartment, sleep-deprived in the early hours of the morning, then wake up around 6:30 or 7 a.m. to start the day. I started noticing that in the morning, my door would be unlocked sometimes. I usually dismissed this as my sleep-deprived brain, thinking the bed looked more appealing than locking the door. Another thing I noticed since moving in was that I seemed to misplace things more than I used to. Little things like a hairbrush or nail polish. It wasn't really that big of a deal, just enough to be a slight annoyance in my day. The longer I lived there, the more frequently I seemed to forget to lock the door. At first, it was every once in a while. Then it became an almost daily occurrence. More things went missing. Things like pictures, shaving razors, and most disturbingly, my underwear. This went on long enough that I started to get a little paranoid. I began taking the time at night to make sure the door was locked. I got into the habit of, every night after locking the door, turning the handle 3 times and saying to myself, "It's locked, it's locked, it's locked." Time after time, I would wake up and find the door unlocked. One time I even tried staying up all night to watch the door, but I ended up falling asleep in my chair. I decided that my mind was not reliable enough to stay up all night, so I invested in a video camera. I went all out and bought the fanciest camera I could get my hands on. One night, I set the camera up facing the door. I hid it under a pile of towels on the floor. I locked the door and went to bed. When I woke up, my apartment looked normal. Nothing seemed missing. I decided to check the tape. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage, seeing nothing. I was just about to give up when I noticed the handle of the door jitter. Then it slowly crept open. A figure slid through the half-open door and walked toward the camera. It paused, looked around as if listening for something, then walked forward into full view of the camera. I paused the tape. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck started to rise. I was staring directly into the face of the building's maintenance man. I could see those big, thick glasses and curly hair. I had no doubt who it was. I played the tape a little more. He looked comfortable as he walked around the apartment. Then he turned and walked toward my bedroom and out of the camera's view. I didn't know what to do. Sobbing, I called the police. I tried to explain over the phone but couldn't. Soon enough, 2 officers arrived at my door. I told them everything and showed them the tape. I remember seeing the blood drain from their faces. They promised me I was safe and that they were going to get this guy. I needed to lie down but didn't want to be alone. One of the officers offered to stand outside my apartment door while I took a nap. As I was lying in bed, unable to sleep but too drained to move, something kept nagging at me. I lay there for a few minutes, tossing and turning, unable to get comfortable or rest. My mind was racing. Then a realization slowly washed over me and chilled me to the bone. We watched the tape and saw the man enter my home, but we never saw him leave. I froze, then started shaking. I needed to get to the front door. I sat up and looked around the room. I couldn't see anyone. I swung my legs over the side of the bed cautiously. My feet hit the cold wood floor, and I felt warm breath on my ankles. I raced out of my apartment as fast as I could and ran to the safety of the police officer. He called for backup. They found the man under my bed, clutching a knife and a Polaroid camera. Story 2. A girl in her teens gets called to babysit some kids on a Friday evening. Apparently, she watches those 2 girls pretty regularly. Anyway, the parents leave for the evening and say they won't be home until around midnight. The teenager puts the 2 young girls to bed around 9 p.m. She does what most people would do, goes downstairs and watches TV for a while. She watches TV for an hour or so, and by this point, it's getting pretty late. She's in the living room on the main level. The TV sits in the corner of the room, with large windows on each side of it. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she sees what she thinks is someone walking by the window outside through the bushes. Naturally, she gets pretty freaked out. She ends up calling 911 and the police arrive. The police check outside but don't find any signs of anyone walking around. I guess it was winter, with snow on the ground. The police officers assure her she's safe and that the lighting from both the TV and the lamp probably played tricks on her by reflecting off the window. The teen agrees that's probably what it was, yet she asks them to check inside the house just to be safe. The police reluctantly oblige and start randomly checking rooms, closets, and the garage a bit haphazardly. They roll their eyes a bit, wondering how much this girl's imagination has run wild. Well, turns out they find a man hiding underneath one of the little girl's beds. As the story goes, it was the little girl's mother's ex-husband. The babysitter didn't see someone walk past the window outside. What she saw was the reflection of him walking behind the couch. Story 3. A man is driving a regular route along the highway when he notices a turnoff that will take him up through the mountains. He figures he drives this way all the time, but has never taken the mountain path, even though it will only take him a few hours longer to reach his destination. As a spur-of-the-moment decision, he takes the turn and begins his journey up the winding road. He'd started his drive later in the day than usual, so the sky is getting dark as he approaches the top. But the view is gorgeous. As he continues, he gets a small chill up the base of his neck, but dismisses it as the cool mountain air. Not long after, he has to slow his car as he approaches what appears to be a nasty car accident. 2 cars are completely totaled, looking like they hit each other head-on just after rounding a corner. The man can see a few bodies on the ground, all bloodied and not moving. Immediately, he knows he has to pull over and help, but he can't shake a sixth sense telling him something about the scene is wrong, like it isn't natural. He decides he's going to drive his car forward and park it just beyond the crash site before getting out to help. He slowly creeps by the wreck and manages a better look at one of the bodies. It's definitely human, but something seems off. He still can't place it. He rolls the car forward maybe 6 meters from the crash site. Just as he's about to come to a stop and open his door to investigate, he looks out his front windshield for a moment. It's gotten terribly dark now, nearly pitch black, when something in his rearview mirror catches his eye. Several somethings, in fact. As he gazes into the mirror in horror, he sees the bodies at the crash site illuminated by his rear lights. All of them are sitting up, staring directly at his car, eyes like glowing orbs in the mirror. He panics as more figures come out from the ditches and forest surrounding the road. But only when the crash victim bodies begin to stand, seemingly fine, not limping or dragging themselves, does he have the presence of mind to throw the car back into drive. By the time the first people are taking careful steps toward the vehicle, he's already speeding as fast as he can around the bend and getting the hell off the mountain. Nothing ever came for him, nor did it seem like he was ever followed. Sometimes he wonders if his mind played a trick on him, but still, to this day, he always checks his rearview mirror before ever stepping out of the car. Story 4. All right, figured I'd share one of my own. This story was told to me by my great aunt, one of my grandmother's 9 sisters. In Cuba, where we're all from, the summers tend to get hot. Coupled with the lack of air conditioning, you'd have to be wealthy to own a unit, people tend to sleep with doors and windows open. One night, my Aunt T was putting her grandchildren to sleep. She laid in bed with them, and they were alone in the home. One of her sisters, Berta, was supposed to be keeping them company that night, but a last-minute event made her change where she slept. My Aunt T says that sometime around 9 p.m., she noticed a figure who, by her description, must have been 7 feet tall. It was human-shaped but seemed to float inside the home. If it had legs, they weren't visible because a long robe of some sort covered them and dragged along the floor. At this point, rather than scream in fear, my Aunt T decided to lay perfectly still so as not to wake the children. She saw the figure cross the hallway and head into her room, looming ominously over them. The face she described was that of a pale woman with big red lips, and her hair and dreads like that of a Rastafarian man. There were just shadows, cavities as she called them, where her eyes would have been. It left her room through the same way it entered, but didn't leave. My aunt's house is large, and she swears she saw the figure go in and out of each room, take about the same amount of time, then leave. Eventually, it ran out of places in the home to visit and simply glided out the front door. My aunt cries to this very day because the next morning, her sister Berta was found deceased. Everyone thought it must have been some sort of heart attack or stroke in her sleep because no one heard anything, and they found her where she had laid the night before, only lifeless. My aunt swears the thing must have been death itself, searching for her sister where she should have been. Story 5. My cousin was in a band and did some touring for a while. He ran into another band from the Illinois area that had a creepy story to tell. They spent their days on the road and didn't make a lot of money, so they always depended on fans to find places to stay. After playing a show, there was a particular fan who seemed really interested. He offered them a place to stay. His parents were really involved in their church and were absent from the house. The band members were kind of curious about this, so they asked him if his parents were on a mission. He just kind of awkwardly smiled and didn't answer the question. Later that night, the band members were getting hungry and thought about raiding the guy's fridge. However, they decided since he was being such a good host, they didn't want to be rude. A few days later, they saw a story on the news about a guy who had harmed his parents, dismembered them, and placed them in his freezer. The person who was arrested under suspicion was the same guy they had stayed with. His parents were in the freezer when they talked about raiding the fridge. Story 6. This was told to me by my aunt. My apologies for any lack of detail, as my grandmother died years before I was born. Also, I don't know how true this is. First off, my mother was one of 10 children. When she was a teen, her parents and half her siblings moved to the east. My aunts and uncles have told me that something was strange around that house. They would hear voices running upstairs when no one was there, a rocking chair would rock when no one was in it, and so on. Eventually, my grandmother was diagnosed with brain cancer. She was in her bed at home recuperating from her most recent surgery, and my aunt was there alone taking care of her. My grandmother was completely bedbound at this point. It was impossible for her to walk. She had a habit of blotting her healing incisions on her scalp with tissues, which wasn't great for the wounds. Because of this, the tissue box was kept across the room from her bed. My aunt brought in my grandmother's lunch on a tray and set it down on her lap. My grandmother asked her for the tissues for her head, and my aunt reminded her that she wasn't supposed to use them. My grandmother then asked for a drink. My aunt went to the kitchen and brought back her drink, only to find her mother with the tissues, still in bed, blotting her head. My aunt took them away and again reminded her she shouldn't do that. That's when she realized that her mother couldn't get out of bed. So she asked, "Mom, how did you even get these?" My grandmother replied, "Oh, that little girl that always follows you around gave them to me." Story 7. Last year I worked with a guy who'd spent some time on oil rigs in the North Sea. He told me that there was a really huge storm, pounded the place hard, and that this happened all the time out there. In the morning, they had to assess the damage, and they saw that there was a platform down by the water that was partially submerged. Normally, it sits just above the waterline. Being the low guy on the totem pole, he went down first, and he told me the whole thing was a death trap, the platform barely hanging on. He said he got to the bottom where the rest was in the water, and just as soon as he stepped on it, the platform started sinking fast. He had to run up the stairs, and when he got to the landing above, the whole section beneath him broke off and sank. But what really got me is when he said it wasn't like it just sank. It was like the metal was pulled until it broke. Like something big grabbed it from underneath and dragged it down. And whatever it was, it only did that when he stepped into the water. Like it had been a trap. He told me that afterward they kept getting damage they couldn't explain. Metal ladders broken, pipes sheared off, always during storms. Sometimes guys went missing, which was the worst part. He told me that the media was told it was due to some kind of leak, but that wasn't the real reason they evacuated the place. And apparently the same thing had happened to other rigs in the North Sea. Story 8. So, here's a story of my friend. He lives in an apartment complex in the city. The place is 10 stories high, and he lives on the 8th. One night, he was heading home and arrived at the main lobby around 11 p.m. He waited for the elevator, and when the door opened, a man rudely bumped into him and hurriedly walked out of the lobby. My friend didn't think much of it until he got back to his room. As he looked into his bathroom mirror to brush his teeth, he found bits of blood on the very shoulder where the man had bumped him. The next day was a Saturday, and he was getting ready for a date. He had just taken a shower when he heard a knock on the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw a policeman. The officer was a man in his mid-40s, with short dark hair and a shaved-off left eyebrow. The man asked through the door, "There was a murder last night at around 10:50 p.m., and I'd like to ask if you saw anything in particular." My friend had seen something in particular. He had bumped into a man who left blood on his shoulder. But he replied, "No, sir, I know nothing of the sort." He was already late for his date and didn't want to get involved. The man responded, "All right, thank you for your time," and left. My friend went to his date and came back home later that day feeling a bit guilty. He'd lied to a police officer. Then he flicked on the TV, and the news was covering the murder in his apartment building. Great, he thought. Way to make me feel more guilty. But then the news said the killer had been caught. The culprit's photo came on the screen, and there he was, a guy in his mid-40s with short dark hair and a shaved-off left eyebrow. He wasn't a police officer. He was a man who had been out to eliminate any witnesses. Story 9. This happened to me, and it still freaks me out when I'm home alone. When I was 16, a few summers ago, my parents went out for the day, and my sister left to go out too. I live in a small, average suburban neighborhood. I was stuck in the house bored with my dog, with nobody else home. It was really hot in the living room, so I turned on the air conditioner. For that to happen, I needed to open the garage door because the back of the unit faces that way, and the garage gets overheated. Usually when we do this, we lock the garage door that leads into the living room, but this one time I forgot. I sat down in my room and relaxed, not thinking much of it. Bad idea. A few hours later in the afternoon, I heard my dog barking like a maniac. I almost ignored it, but I went into the living room and heard the doorknob on the garage door jiggling. I assumed my sister had come home, so I yelled, "It's not locked!" She didn't respond and the doorknob jiggled more violently. I walked up to the door, yelling again, "It's not L." When the door opened, it felt like slow motion. The door creaked open just a sliver, and that's all I needed to see. I saw the feet, huge dark brown hiking boots of a man. Not my sister. I immediately pushed on the door to close it and started screaming and crying hysterically. I'm a small girl, but I struggled to push it shut and lock it. He started pounding on the door, but then it stopped. Still crying, I scooped up my dog and ran into the kitchen to get a knife. As I entered the kitchen, I heard the gate in the backyard open and quick footsteps down the cement path. Like something out of a horror movie with tears streaming down my face, I screamed. Dog in one hand and knife in the other, I threw the knife on the floor and ran to lock the back door. When I quickly bent down on the kitchen floor to pick up the knife, my legs were shaking from fear. My weak legs gave out, and I fell forward almost onto my face. I tried to scramble to my feet, but ended up crawling and tripping on the kitchen floor, accidentally scratching a long, shallow cut on my bare foot with the knife. I hid under the dining room table and said my prayers. I thought this was it. This was how I was going to die, alone in the quiet house with my dog as the only witness. I held my mouth to muffle my crying as I heard footsteps approach the back door. My heart was racing a million beats a minute, and I had the knife tightly clenched in my hand as I waited for him to make his next move. I saw his shadow through the blinds looking into the window. He stood there for a while and then walked away. The police never found him. To this day, I always make sure the door is locked when the garage doors open. I don't know what would have happened if my dog hadn't barked and alerted me. I might have been in my room completely unaware until it was too late. Story 10. It's late. There are 3 people on a subway train sitting in a row. 2 men and a woman in the middle. A teenage girl walks onto the subway and sits across from the 3 strangers. The woman in the middle has an expressionless look on her face, while the 2 men are staring directly into the teenager's eyes. Shortly after, a businessman enters the subway and sits next to the teenager. After a few minutes, he pulls out his notepad and writes, "Get off at the next stop. Trust me." When the next stop comes, the teenager and the businessman get up to exit the train, and the 2 men verbally try to stop them. Once they get off, the man explains to the teenager that the woman in the middle of the 2 men was deceased, and they were after her next. I heard this story when I was in 7th grade. Always freaked me out. Story 11. I once had a friend tell me about a girl she knew who met up with a guy she met on some online dating site. They met for dinner, and afterwards, he walked her to her car. He kept trying and trying to get her to go home with him. She declined all the invites, and eventually they kissed goodnight and went their separate ways. A few days later, she gets some weird bumps on her lips and goes to the doctor. After examining her, the doctor seems genuinely concerned and asks her about her most recent romantic encounter, because what she has is some sort of bacteria or infection on her lips that you can only get from contact with a decomposing body. Story 12. I remember reading a creepypasta about this guy on a train. He takes the same train or bus every day and begins to notice this strange man who rides the train but never seems to leave, and no one else seems to notice him. Eventually, he ends up following this man all the way to the last stop at the end of the day. He follows him into an old sort of train tunnel or subway system and ends up losing him, getting lost himself. He manages to get back to the surface, only to realize he's not in his own dimension anymore. And the only way he can get back or move to another dimension is by getting someone else to follow him into the tunnel. But because these people or beings look so different, he has to sit perfectly still until he's almost invisible to them. So he sits on the train day after day until someone finally notices and starts to follow him. Story 13. Not a very good writer or storyteller, but this one happened in Iraq. A member of my squad, a fairly odd individual who will be called X, started complaining one week that he kept seeing something through his NVGs during night patrols in the city. He wasn't sure what it was, but it didn't seem human or familiar, so it raised no real suspicion, and we just thought, oh, that's just X being X, and laughed it off. A few days go by, and after another night patrol, he can't sleep. He's sweating and clearly distressed. We're all asking him, dude, what's going on? You all right? His response was, death is following me. He claimed to see a shadowy figure floating from rooftop to rooftop, following our patrol. It was only visible through NVGs, not with the streetlights or anything else. If you've ever been to Iraq and used NVGs and just watched the sky, sometimes there would be weird flashes and stuff with no explanation, but we figured it was satellites or drones or something. He was dead serious about it, but again, we just thought, that's X being X, and laughed it off. The very next day, X was killed in action. It freaked out our whole platoon, and to this day, we really don't know what to make of it. Story 14. A young boy is sitting in class when he notices a girl of about the same age out the window and across the street. She smiles and holds up a hand, giving him the peace sign. The next time he looks, she's gone, but it looks like she dropped something. At recess, he crosses the street to where she was and finds a Polaroid picture of the girl holding up her 2 fingers like before. He can't get her off his mind for the rest of the day. There's something just a little bit off about the way she looked at him. That night, the boy wakes up to a sound outside his window. When he looks out, he sees the girl again, smiling strangely and holding up 2 fingers. He climbs out the window and begins to follow her. As he's crossing the street to where she's standing, a car crests the hill and strikes him, ending his life instantly. The driver, distraught, jumps out of the car and finds the boy already gone. In his hand, the boy is clutching a photograph of the young girl, smiling strangely and holding up 3 fingers. Story 15. Reposting something I had written for another thread a while back. Since I was about 5, every few years or so, I see the same person in my dreams. It is genderless, has pale skin, long black hair, typical ring girl look-alike. But the first time I saw it, I was 5, which was in 1996, and that character didn't even exist yet. Anyway, sometimes it will be in the background of my dreams. Sometimes I'll be having a regular dream, and then I get a distinct feeling that it is being interrupted, and I have a brief moment where this genderless entity is staring at me. Then I go back to my regular dream. The worst one was a dream where I was being chased by it. I ended up crouched down in the kitchen of a house made entirely of glass. It found me, picked me up, and started shaking me as the room spun around and around. All I remember is the room spinning in a blur around us, as if we were standing still. And it, the entity, was just staring at me. We didn't break eye contact until I woke up, but I woke up because I couldn't breathe. I felt like a 5-ton weight was on my whole body. I was lying on my back. I never sleep on my back. Then the weight started lifting as if someone had been lying on top of me and got up. Last time I saw it in my dreams was about 3 years ago. I don't think I've ever gone much longer than that without seeing it, so I'm afraid I'm due for a visit soon. Story 16. I had a friend who grew up deep in Appalachia. He once admitted that as a child, he would sometimes look up from his bed at night and see a green face watching him. It would move its mouth like it was saying something, but it was silent. He would always try to convince himself he was dreaming and would rattle off prayers until he fell asleep. It never did anything other than watch him, so he eventually dismissed it as a normal part of dream time. He switched rooms a few times as he got older, and strangely, he'd stop seeing the face. But when he moved back into that room, the face would return. He'd never told anyone. His family was deeply religious, so he wanted to avoid any panic about demons or evil spirits. After college, he and his brother were reminiscing, and he finally asked his brother, "When you were staying in that room, Did you ever see, to which his brother interrupted, a green face? He said he turned white because he'd truly convinced himself it wasn't real. Both of them were too nervous to talk about it further, except to confirm that it was just a green face that watched them and mumbled inaudibly. When they visited home after that, they refused to sleep in that room. Story 17. I'm a little late to the party, but I've always wanted to tell people about this experience I had when I was about 10. I used to have a sleepwalking problem. One night I had a dream. In the dream, I got out of bed, walked downstairs, and took a steak knife out of the silverware drawer. Then I walked up to my parents' bedroom and went to stand next to my dad since he was sleeping closest to the door. He woke up and said, "You okay, sweetheart?" Then I started stabbing him, and when my mom woke up, I started stabbing her as well. After my little stabbing episode, I went back downstairs and fell asleep on the couch. Well, that morning, I woke up on the couch, and the knife was on the floor beside me. I went into panic mode and ran upstairs, expecting to find my parents hurt or worse. They were fine. Everything was normal. I went back downstairs and got some cereal. My dad got up a little after I did and sat down with some coffee. This is the part that freaked me out. He asked me what I was doing last night. I asked him what he meant. He said I got up, went downstairs, came back upstairs, and stood by the bed for a good 5 minutes. I asked him if he said anything. He said he asked me what was wrong, and then I just walked back downstairs and he didn't hear another peep. Still freaks me out to this day. Story 18. It may not be that scary, but it's a true story, and it happened to me. And it's one of the scariest things I've ever experienced. In 2002, I remember distinctly because it was right after I got married. My husband and I were on a road trip to visit his brother at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. This was before navigation systems were common, so we printed the route from Yahoo Maps and were following the directions. We were pretty naive and didn't know much about the route, and at one point mountains started appearing. Then I said, "I think we're driving through the Appalachian Mountains." My husband laughed at me because he had no concept of basic geography and said I was making things up. We eventually stopped at a gas station and picked up a map, and it turns out I was right. This particular route kept popping up, and I saw that we needed to be on it eventually. Thinking I was being smart, I decided we should just get off on that route the next time it came up and save some time. So we get off. It's about 2 a.m., pitch black, and now we're in the middle of the woods. We come to a fork in the road and have no idea which way to go because we had veered off course and no longer had turn-by-turn directions. I completely freaked out, and my husband said, "Calm down, I'll call my dad. His brain is like a map. He was a truck driver. He'll know what to do." Then we pulled out our cell phones. No reception. At this point, I'm crying because I feel like I've made a stupid decision and something just didn't feel right. Then my husband says, "My gut is telling me to go left." So we went left. Finally, we saw lights. We pulled into a gas station to get directions, and luckily it was one of those gas stations right off the highway. You could literally pull off and back on directly from there. As we approached the station, the attendant was outside sitting on a lawn chair, just hanging out with some people. I think they were more surprised to see Latinos in that area at that hour than we were about them hanging out at a gas station at 2:30 a.m. Anyway, we explained what had happened and how we got off the highway. I will never forget the look on that woman's face. She did one of those shudders like when your whole body chills uncontrollably. She looked me dead in the eyes and said in the most serious and somber tone, "Never, ever get off that highway. Those are the back roads, and you don't want to know what's out there." We got back in the car, drove off, stayed on the highway, and never looked back. If this sounds familiar to anyone, it might be because there was a movie with a similar storyline where the outcome wasn't as lucky. Note, the movie came out after this happened to us. A couple years later, we were watching Wrong Turn. Same premise. People get lost after taking the wrong path in the Appalachian woods. As scared as I was at the time, nothing compares to the utter fear I felt after watching that movie and realizing how close we might have come to a real-life nightmare. What if we had gone right instead of left? It still gives me chills. I know it was just a movie, but being in the exact same scenario made it hit way too close to home. Story 19. I was chatting with a couple at work the other day. They come in all the time, and we got to talking about weird, creepy stuff. The husband told me a story that had happened to him. We'll call him Dave. Dave does handyman and electrical work, And one day someone called him and asked if he could quote them for some work on their house. Dave showed up, examined the house, discussed the job, and quoted a price which they agreed to. Out of curiosity, he asked how they found him. That's when they told him a strange story. They said they had first tried calling a different electrician, also named Dave, whose number they found in an old phone book. That Dave had come out, inspected the house, given them a quote, seemed friendly, and left after giving them a number to call if they wanted the work done. A few days later, they called the number to schedule the job. A woman answered and got upset when they asked for Dave. Tearfully, she asked if they were playing some sort of cruel joke. She explained that she was the widow of the electrician named Dave, who had passed away almost 2 years earlier. Story 20. A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him that, on the way to his room, there was a door with no number that was locked and that no one was allowed to enter. She explained that it was a storage room and off limits. She reminded him of this several times before allowing him to go upstairs. So following her instructions, he went straight to his room and went to bed. However, her insistence had sparked his curiosity, so the next night he walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. Sure enough, it was locked. He bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom like his, and in the corner was a woman whose skin was incredibly pale. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion. Was this a celebrity? The owner's daughter? He almost knocked on the door but decided not to. As he was still looking, the woman turned sharply and he jumped back, hoping she wouldn't suspect he had been watching her. He crept away and went back to his room. The next day he returned to the door and looked through the keyhole again. This time all he saw was red, just a deep, unmoving red. Perhaps the room's occupants had realized he was spying and blocked the view. Feeling embarrassed, he hoped she hadn't reported him to the front desk. Eventually, he asked the woman at the front desk for more information. After some persistence and a promise to keep it to himself, she finally said, "I might as well tell you. A long time ago, a man took his wife's life in that room. People still feel uncomfortable staying there. But those people, they weren't ordinary. They were white all over, except for their eyes, which were red." Story 21. My teacher once told us a story about a camp he went to when he was young. The owner of the camp told the kids it was strictly forbidden to go into a particular house on the property, one where the windows and doors were all sealed. When they asked why, he explained that it had once been an orphanage where the children had been mistreated, and some had tragically passed away. The house was now haunted by those children. Some of the boys in my teacher's class wanted to act brave and decided to sneak into the house when the owner was asleep. My teacher was one of them. When they entered, everything looked normal, just very dusty. No one had been there in years. They walked upstairs to the second floor where they saw an old rocking chair. One of the boys sat down in it, looked at the others, and said with a terrified expression, "The chair is warm." They decided to leave before anyone noticed they were gone. But as they started walking down the stairs, they heard footsteps running on the second floor behind them. They ran out of the house and back to their cabins. The next morning, the owner came to them, visibly shaken, and asked if anyone had gone into the house. They denied it to avoid getting in trouble. The owner looked scared and said he believed the spirits of the children could move objects. Story 22. So this story isn't really scary so much as it is an amazing psychological commentary. It's also a true story, or so I've been led to believe. My father was a cop for like 30-something years, and he has all sorts of crazy stories. While it's entirely possible this was made up, I have no reason not to believe it, even though it's probably the craziest of his stories. At the time, in the early 90s, he was a shift leader and basically in charge of the other officers, including the one that responded to this call. The officer arrived at a house around 1 a.m. The whole house was lit up, lights on everywhere. He knocked on the door and got no direct answer, but swore he heard a startled cry from somewhere inside. He knocked again and got no response. Given the serious nature of the 911 call, he feared the worst. He yelled, "Police, I'm coming in!" and forced his way through the door. As he entered, he finally got a frantic reply, "We're up here," from the top of the stairs in front of him. What immediately caught his attention, though, was that there appeared to be feces smeared around the place. The house, which would have been quite nice, was now in a state of disarray. Making his way up the stairs, he found a naked couple wrapped in a bedsheet, huddled in the corner of the master bedroom. They were completely terrified, and the man had a death grip on a candlestick. The officer also noticed there was more filth on them, and they looked entirely disheveled and panicked. Here's what happened. The couple was cooking dinner around 7 p.m. when they got a phone call. The woman answered in another room. The caller identified himself as the master of torture and claimed he was watching them from outside with a shotgun, ready to enter and harm them if she didn't comply. The man was still in the kitchen at this point and could hear his wife talking, clearly upset. She wasn't answering his questions about who was on the line. When he walked in, she was already starting to undress, visibly shaking. Alarmed, he grabbed the phone and made the acquaintance of the so-called master of torture. What followed over the next 5 hours was horrifying. The couple was forced to humiliate themselves, defecating and urinating on each other, performing inappropriate acts, being violated with utensils, and even made to eat their own waste, all in view of the windows. This continued until the caller demanded the man cut his wife with a knife. That's when he screamed something into the phone, hung up, and called the police. Then they ran upstairs, wrapped themselves in a sheet, and waited in the corner. As the officer stood there listening, waiting for backup, he remained cautious. His first question was whether they had seen the person responsible. The couple looked at each other and shook their heads no. Story 23. This is not a story. It actually happened to me. I was visiting my grandmother in Mexico City. She had a large 2-story house, and we were upstairs on the floor with the bedrooms. It was really late at night, and my grandmother was already asleep. I was still up watching TV when I heard an animal roar really loudly outside through my open window. This wasn't a normal roar. It was incredibly loud. The closest thing I could compare it to was a lion or a tiger. It was really strange because this was in the middle of a gigantic city, nowhere near the wilderness. The zoo was also across town, so there was no chance the sound came from there. It went on for quite a while, roaring, growling, pacing up and down the street below my window for more than an hour. I was completely freaked out, but couldn't bring myself to look out the window. Eventually, I built up enough courage to go into my grandfather's study, grabbed his gun, loaded it, and went back to my room. I lay in bed dreading the idea that whatever was making that awful noise would look up and see the light coming from my open window. The noise continued for a while, and then finally it started to move away. Eventually, I mustered enough courage to look outside. I didn't see anything, but I could still hear the roaring, now in the distance. The next day, I searched all the newspapers and local news looking for a story about a wild animal escape, but I found nothing. I didn't tell anyone about it for years. I'm still not sure what to make of it. To sum up, I was visiting my grandma in the middle of a huge city, heard a large beast roar and pace outside the house, cowered in fear while holding a loaded gun, too scared to look outside until it was gone, and still have no idea what it was. Story 24. There was a story about a young Chinese couple who had been dating for a few months. The young man had grown tired of the relationship and decided to break things off. The girl, heartbroken, ended her life by jumping while wearing a red dress. In Chinese lore, this symbolizes a desire to return as a ghost in the state of her violent death. And according to the belief, she would come back in 7 days to haunt him. The young man, terrified, went to consult a sensei about his growing fears. The sensei told him that the only way to avoid the ghost was to hide under his bed on the 7th day, because if she couldn't find him in his room, she would leave. As the evening of the 7th day approached, the young man followed the advice. He hid under his bed before midnight. Just as the clock struck 12, he heard familiar whispers outside his bedroom door. He knew she had come. Still, he felt safe. She wouldn't look under the bed, he reassured himself. The doorknob turned, the door creaked open. The next day, the sensei tried calling to see if the advice had worked, but received no answer. Concerned, he rushed to the young man's apartment. The front door was ajar. He went straight to the bedroom and found the young man deceased under the bed, his face frozen in terror. This can't be right, the sensei thought. She wouldn't have seen him unless... Then he found a newspaper clipping of her death that the man had kept. That's when he realized what had happened. She had fallen head first, and when she came back to haunt his room, she came upside down. Story 25. About a year ago, one of my fellow Marines showed me a documentary about a serial attacker in Predator in Long Island. Not to brag, but I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. Yet everything about this film was disturbing. It started with a news investigation that exposed a children's mental hospital for what it truly was, a horrific place filled with abuse, neglect, and trauma. The footage was grainy 1980s news video showing institutionalized children wandering aimlessly, naked, neglected, and covered in filth. The staff and orderlies were nowhere to be seen and clearly didn't care. Many weren't even on the premises half the time. What made this hospital particularly unique was its system of underground tunnels, originally used for storage. But over time, the staff began using them to engage in illegal behavior, including substance use in the abuse of vulnerable patients. Eventually, the hospital was shut down, and the children were relocated. Tragically, some had no families to return to and ended up in group homes or foster care. A few were so severely mentally impaired or traumatized that they slipped through the cracks and were never seen again. Years later, Long Island was rocked by a string of brutal crimes occurring in and around the area where the hospital once stood. The documentary team suspected that some of the missing former patients could be connected to the spree. They started investigating, and what they uncovered was chilling. Abandoned encampments, discarded evidence kits, holes in the ground leading back into the old tunnels, you name it. The entire tone of the film was deeply unsettling. It was informative and well-researched, yet overwhelmingly dark and hopeless. Even more unsettling, they never determined who was behind the crimes or how many people were involved. If anyone has seen this documentary or followed up on those crimes, I'd love to hear what you know. The whole thing still sticks with me. Story 26. My dad told me this story that happened to him when he was younger, late teens. He and some friends were planning a hiking and camping trip one weekend in Puebla, Mexico. He was raised in Mexico City. They took a bus out of town, which dropped them off in a small village at the base of a mountain. They hiked up until they found a place to camp and set up for the night. They built a fire and began to talk and joke around, like teenagers tend to do. One of them even bragged that he had swiped a bottle of tequila from his old man, just to stay warm. All of a sudden, one of them pointed to the mountain across the ridge and the strange lights he saw there. These lights were like nothing they had ever seen before. Unlike car headlights, which travel in a uniform direction up the side of the mountain, these lights moved erratically and in every direction. They watched for a while, but then everything around them suddenly got extremely dark. My dad said that had it not been for the fire they built, they wouldn't have been able to see more than a couple of feet in front of them. Not even the moon or stars were visible. Then an overwhelming sense of panic took hold of every single one of them. One of his friends even took 2 sticks and made a makeshift crucifix that they all gathered around. They pulled out the tequila, got drunk, and eventually passed out. The next morning, they hiked back down to the small town for breakfast. When they told the people at the restaurant what had happened, an old man told them that what they saw were witches. Puebla is known for its folklore involving witches. He explained that even though the lights appeared to be on the opposite mountain, they were actually much closer. The lights were a method used to confuse hikers, and the darkness and panic were caused to disorient and trap people. Many hikers had gone missing up there and were never found. It was said that the witches would take people, either to harm them or sacrifice them. The old man told them they were lucky to have made it back. So anyway, you might think this story was made up. All I can say is that every time my dad retells it, he fully believes it happened. I've never once seen anything in his expression that would make me think he was fabricating it, unlike some of the more exaggerated boogeyman tales he'd tell us. Story 27. When I was a little kid, I remember my grandpa telling me about how he loved to go hiking and camping. He told me about this lake once, located on the island where he lives. He was in a boat rowing across the lake and said he found it strange that there were no birds or signs of wildlife anywhere nearby. Then in the middle of the lake, he saw a creature that had sectioned plates like a centipede, except it was really large and had leafy frond-like feet. He said it was about a foot wide. At first, he thought it was some kind of plant, so he touched it with his oar. That's when he was overcome with a fear unlike anything he had ever felt. The creature glided over the water quickly and vanished. He said he was so shaken that he abandoned his camping gear and couldn't bring himself to go back for it for almost 2 weeks. Later in life, someone else, who is well known on the island for being the youngest shaman in the tribe's history, also reported seeing something similar, but in this version, the creature was much larger and glided across the surface of the lake, not flying, then disappeared into the woods. There's something else that always stuck with me. My grandpa, who lived through war and horrific things, he once told me about having to care for people who were terribly wounded and beyond saving, could speak about those experiences with a composed face. But not this. When he told the lake story, his face would go pale. That haunted expression, the way his voice changed, is what stayed with me for years. Not because of the creature itself, but because I've never seen fear in his eyes like I did when he described that moment. That's why to this day, I have an irrational fear of being in lake water. Story 28. I know I'm a little late on this, but I had a really creepy experience once with one of my buddies. One time when we were about 15, we went to a high school football game. We were never really the type to care about football. We just wanted an excuse to hang out. About halfway through the game, my buddy looks over at me and says, "Hey man, want to dip out of here and go smoke a cigarette in the woods?" I said, "This is lame, of course." On the opposite side of the road, there was a giant forest and no houses on that particular stretch. We walked about half a mile down the road, found an opening, and went about 100 yards into the woods. Since it was around 9 at night, it was pitch black in the forest, but we could kind of see where we were going because of the moonlight. As we were standing there smoking and talking, I heard some twigs snapping, like someone walking, but it stopped shortly after. I didn't say anything. My buddy hadn't heard it, so I kept quiet. A couple minutes later, I heard footsteps again. I interrupted my friend, asking if he heard the noise, but he didn't. "Probably a deer or something," he said. I agreed and continued chatting. My buddy was facing me and the direction we came from, and I was looking out into the wilderness. I heard the footsteps again, this time very close, and my buddy heard them too. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about this again. He turned to look toward the sound, and at that moment, we saw the silhouette of an adult person go from a crouching position to standing up. We both took off, running as fast as we could. When we reached the road, I don't think I'd ever run that fast in my life. I didn't even look back to see if anyone was following us. The most disturbing part of it is, there's no way they could have followed us from the game. We made sure no one was behind us when we walked, and if someone had come from the road, we would have heard them. The sound came from deep in the woods. Story 29. I know I'm too late, but I can't not share this. I read Helter Skelter, written by the prosecuting attorney in the Manson murders. It's hands down the best true crime book I've ever read, and I love true crime, so I recommend it highly. But the creepiest part was something the Manson family called creepy crawlies. Apparently, some of their victims were stalked for quite a while before anything happened. Back in those days, it was common to leave doors unlocked. The Manson family would sneak into random, unlocked homes at night and do nothing but watch the family sleep. Sometimes they would move small things around, like moving a watch from the nightstand to a dresser. One of the families that was later killed had a mother who'd been telling her daughter for months that she thought she was going crazy because little things kept changing in the house. A lamp on a different table, a picture slightly tilted. And then after months of watching, the murders happened. For no reason. The victims hadn't done anything wrong. The Manson family had no connection or grudge. The most famous of the murders, Sharon Tate and her friends, occurred simply because they were staying in a house that used to be owned by someone who had once denied Manson a record deal. The fact that people were sneaking into homes at night, just standing there watching others sleep, sometimes silently moving things around, and eventually deciding to end lives for no reason other than that the victims were there. That's one of the most terrifying and true things I've ever read. Story 30. My aunt lives in the middle of the desert in a small remote town inhabited by fewer than 1,000 people. The nearest grocery store is 20 miles away, and homes are spread far apart. Her property is 40 acres large, making it perfect for dirt bike riding, horses, and other desert activities. I spent a lot of my childhood at her home enjoying those adventures and family time. However, there are also a lot of creepy things that happen in isolated places. I'll start with a couple that don't involve me. Apparently, there's a top-secret military base in the hills up the road from her property that no one goes near. If you do, masked men will reportedly approach you at gunpoint, instruct you to get out of your vehicle, blindfold you, drive you to an unknown location, and then tell you to walk 10,000 steps before removing the blindfold. This allegedly happened to one of my aunt's friends, who said that by the time he removed the blindfold, he was standing alone in the middle of the desert, miles from home. He had to walk to a gas station to call for help. There's also a woman some refer to as a witch who lives a few miles down the road from my aunt. I've never seen her, but we drive past her home every time we visit. Her house is terrifying. It's built of stone or brick, resembling something medieval, and features a large tower often lit with fire at night. The chain-link fence around her property is the worst part. It's decorated with the complete skeletons of various animals. Some resemble cats, others horses, and some are too strange to identify. Now here's my personal story. First, a bit of context. My cousin Luke, when he was younger, would often stare out the window in absolute terror. When my aunt asked what was wrong, he'd cry and beg her to make the red eyes go away. My aunt, being very religious, would pray out loud, saying, "In the name of Jesus, leave." Then Luke would say the eyes disappeared. Fast forward to one summer when there was a wildfire nearby, not threatening my aunt's home, but close enough that some church members had to evacuate. My aunt offered her house as a place for people and horses to stay. One woman who accepted the offer made my aunt uneasy. She had recently been diagnosed with schizophrenia and claimed to be tormented by voices and demons. She wasn't known to be violent, just odd, so my aunt didn't turn her away. The woman stayed for a couple of nights and left without incident. A few weekends later, my mom, siblings, and I visited. One night, my sister and I were in my cousin's room talking before bed. The lights were off, but moonlight came in through the window, giving us some visibility. I was facing the closet mirror while my sister talked, facing the opposite wall. In the reflection, I noticed a black shadow forming near the floor. I assumed it was one of my aunt's cats and wasn't alarmed. But then the shadow morphed into a cloudy shape and slowly floated diagonally up the wall to a corner of the ceiling. As I watched, two appendages curled out of the shadow, shaped like clawed hands ready to strike. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I was imagining things. But then I noticed my sister had gone completely silent, her eyes locked on the same spot. She finally whispered, "What is that?" Then we screamed. We turned on the lights and ran out of the room. The rest of the family heard the noise and we explained what we saw. My aunt gave us a different room to sleep in, and nothing else strange happened during that visit. A couple of weeks later, my aunt called us. After we left, she had her pastor come over to bless the house. Without being told what had happened, he entered the room and immediately walked to the corner where we saw the shadow. "I don't know why," he said, "but I feel something off right here." On the floor, they noticed a hairbrush. My aunt realized it didn't belong to anyone in the house, and the hair in it didn't match anyone. It belonged to the schizophrenic woman. Story 31. In 2008, I was an intern at a home for mentally and physically disabled individuals. Outside, there was a small playground that wasn't used very often, but we could always see it through the glass door. One evening, only myself and an older coworker were on shift. We had already helped everyone get to bed, and I was going around locking the doors before heading home. The night watch would be arriving shortly to take over. As I was locking the glass door, I noticed someone sitting on the swing. Since it was private property, I called over my coworker and asked what we should do. She opened the door slightly and told him to go home. When he didn't move, she raised her voice and said that if he didn't leave, she would call the police. That's when he stood up and began walking toward us. My coworker quickly closed and locked the door. He stopped a few feet away, just standing there and staring. He was dressed entirely in black, so we couldn't see his face or eyes. Then, without saying a word, he wandered off into the darkness. We reported the incident to the night watch and asked him to keep an eye out. We never saw or heard anything about the mystery man again. But after that, working night shifts always felt just a little more unsettling. Story 32. This happened to a girl I know. The story was told to me by her friend, whom I also knew, and I have no reason to believe she made it up. Get ready for a creepy read. I was in Florence, Italy for 6 weeks last summer on a study abroad program with my university. About 2 months after we got back, I was talking with a buddy who had also been on the trip. He started telling me about a girl from our Italian language class. He said it was the creepiest thing he had ever heard. Given Florence's big tourist population, the locals knew it too. Many times girls on our trip would hook up with locals or other study abroad students. At the clubs, locals were always all over the study abroad girls. One girl, who had been in my Italian class, went out one night and was making out with an older guy she assumed was an American living in Florence. His intentions were clear. He wanted to take her home. She was smart enough to say that if they were going anywhere, it had to be to her place, where she had roommates. This might have been the best decision she ever made. The guy kept insisting he had a nice apartment nearby, but she eventually told him she had to leave with her friends. This was about 5 weeks into the trip. Fast forward to a week after the trip ended, she noticed strange bumps around her lips. She freaked out and suspected herpes. A doctor checked it out and said, confused, that the test must be wrong because the infection came from bacteria that only exists on deceased people. She was eventually prescribed antibiotics and it cleared up. About a month later, her cousin in Florence told her that the police had arrested a man who had been taking women home, killing them, and then violating them afterward. It turned out to be the same man she had kissed and almost gone home with. I never spoke to her again after hearing the story, and I can't say for sure if it's 100% true, but it still creeps me out to this day. Story 33. This young guy was headed out to the bar like every other Friday night, hoping to find one, or maybe more, lucky ladies to have a little fun with. Ordering drink after drink, he scanned the place for that special someone. Shut down numerous times and nearly out of cash, he began to feel like his chances were coming to a close, just like every Friday night. On his last drink, a gorgeous blonde sat down beside him, and they started chatting. Hours passed, and the lovely lady asked if he wanted to get some fresh air and go for a walk. The man, of course, was willing to do anything with her, even if it was just a stroll down the old city trail. They walked along the path until they reached a hill that overlooked the town, holding hands and getting closer. At the top, the young man laid down his denim jacket, and they both sat, gazing at the lit-up town below. They kept talking until they locked eyes. A silence settled between them. He took it as his cue and leaned in for a kiss. She kissed back. Things picked up quickly, their intensity rising. Tongues tangled, and before long, she was straddling him, pulling at his button shirt. He didn't hesitate, removing any clothing separating them. They started having sex, right there on the hill. What they failed to notice were the lightning clouds forming above. A storm rolled in fast, and just as they were caught in the heat of the moment, a bolt of lightning struck the highest point in the area, right where they were. The bolt hit the woman directly, killing her instantly and knocking the man unconscious. The heat of the strike melted the condom, fusing the two of them together. When the man woke up, he realized he was stuck inside her corpse. Panicking, he vomited the drinks and fries he'd had at the bar and passed out again. An hour later, he woke to a sickening noise, hard crunching sounds. A bear had arrived, drawn by the scent, and was devouring the woman's face right in front of him. The man lay there frozen, watching the bear feast on what had just been his passionate partner. The bear left after consuming her head, leaving the man in a nightmare no one should ever experience, especially not on a Friday night. Story 34. This happened to me, and 4 years later, I'm just now realizing how weird and scary it really was. We had just moved to a new state and finally got into a house. There were some workers setting up our internet and TV. The kitchen was technically a different room, but instead of a door, it had an open doorway. We also had a window in the kitchen that looked out into the backyard, where the workers were, so I didn't think it was strange when I saw one of them walking toward the kitchen. I was thirsty, so I followed him. I'm short, and this guy was tall and broad, so I couldn't see around him as he stepped into the kitchen ahead of me. But when I walked in, he was gone. Just gone. The only way out of the kitchen was through the opening I had just come through. I had just seen him walk in there. So where the heck did he go? I didn't even care at the time. I grabbed a drink and went back to watching TV. Another creepy thing happened in that same house. I had decided to prank my sister with the old short sheeting trick, where you fold the sheets so a person can't stretch out their legs when they climb into bed. She was using our old bunk beds and slept on the top bunk. I snuck into her room and started folding the sheets. I left the door open because it was super heavy and she was just in the living room. I didn't want her to hear me shut it and catch on. As I was finishing up the prank, the door suddenly slammed shut. It wasn't a breeze. It was a heavy door, and it shut with full force. I just stood there, frozen on the ladder, staring at it. I couldn't believe what had just happened. As soon as I could move, I jumped off the ladder, flung the door open, and ran as fast as I could.